Chris Hedges, as I always say, and I don't apologize for it, should be in the higher reaches of the American government. He is an intellectual of the very first rank. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former head of the Middle East Bureau of the New York Times, when the New York Times could make more of a claim that it was a real newspaper rather than a propaganda sheet. And he's the writer and host of the Chris Hedges Report. I know Australia is not your beat, Chris, but you're well familiar with how Israel seeks to exploit these kind of events and historically has even organized them. What's your immediate takeaway on 16 people murdered on Bondi Beach and 40 severely wounded?
Well, it's blowback to over 2 years of genocide. Let's not forget that on average, with this quote-unquote ceasefire, which is a faux ceasefire, 20 Palestinians are being, many of them children, are being killed daily. And of course, we both lament and the tragedy in Australia, but it's the failure of the international community to lament the genocide in Gaza, which dwarfs this kind of this kind of attack. How do we expect the world, especially the Muslim world, to respond? How do we expect Palestinians to respond when 92% of Gaza is destroyed, 56% of Gaza is now occupied by the Israeli military, and it's a kind of creeping occupation where they have the very poorly marked, quote-unquote, yellow line, demarcation line, which is just being pushed forward on a daily basis. The other day, 2 children, 8 and 10, got too close to that line and they were shot and killed. So I think having spent a lot of time in the Middle East since October 7th, there is an understandable frustration, even rage, that Palestinian lives don't matter, that the Western governments, including Australia, which provides parts for F-35s, is continuing to perpetuate this slaughter, and the world is doing nothing. That doesn't condone it. To understand is not to condone. But we have to begin to understand that without the kind of sophisticated weaponry that Israel has, I mean, that's why you and I have spoken so strongly against the use of the word war in what's happening in Gaza. The Palestinians, of course, do not have a navy, mechanized units, an army, an air force, missiles, not to mention the wholesale surveillance where they're able to track Palestinians 24 hours a day. It's been, and of course, a Plus 972 released that internal Israeli military study that said by the Israeli military's estimates, 83% of the people who have been killed have been civilians. So, and they just, of course, yesterday carried out a targeted assassination, again in violation of the ceasefire, against a Hamas commander. So, blowback, that's a term invented by the CIA after the war in Afghanistan. That's what we're seeing. And I think, as you point out, you can never assume that it isn't a false flag, because Israel has frequently used them. That's how they got the Iraqi Jews to flee Iraq, by bombing synagogues. We now know, mostly because of the research of the great Israeli historian Avi Shlaim, that those bombs were planted in Iraqi synagogues by Israeli agents. So, but it's a gift in many ways, of course, to Netanyahu, who will use it. But I think that the whole ability of the Zionists to essentially conflate Judaism with Zionism has gone a long way into perpetuating this kind of anger and rage. The fact that nearly all Holocaust scholars who see in any criticism of Israel a betrayal of the Holocaust have refused to condemn what's the genocide in Gaza. Not one institution dedicated to researching and commemorating the Holocaust have drawn the obvious historical parallels. or decried the mass slaughter of Palestinians. And this is not lost on especially people in the global south who suffered their own Holocaust, whether that's in India, Kenya, or anywhere else, the Congo, what's now Namibia, the Hamero and the Makwa, on and on. Their Holocausts are never recognized by the Western perpetrators. So I think all of that has been kind of swirled around in a way. And I know from being on the streets in Cairo and Amman and in the West Bank that there's tremendous and legitimate frustration that the world just doesn't intervene when brown people are slaughtered daily, including 20 a day. So let's lament, as we should, and condemn the killing of Australians on a beach. But what about the 20 Palestinians who are being killed every single day in Gaza?
Well, it's difficult to argue with any of that, and I, of course, will not try to. I'll ask if we might shift gear and begin a tour of the flashpoints, which might lead to wars that will dwarf the death toll on Bondi Beach. Let's start with Venezuela. Both you and I believed that Trump would not actually invade Venezuela. We both thought that he might well try to deliver death from the air. But he said yesterday that the land war is starting. Does he mean it? And do the American people have any idea what therefore may lie ahead?
I still am skeptical that we're going to see a wholesale U.S. invasion of Venezuela, given the troop numbers, given the cost, given the debacles of these fiascos in the Middle East that have defined American military adventurism over the last 2 decades. I don't think there's any appetite among the American public. But then there are lots of other methods, and of course, including seizing tankers, blockades, obviously covert activity, which the Trump administration has been quite open about, to foster regime change. All of this has been turbocharged without question. And perhaps I could be wrong, but I'm certain that there's no appetite for it within the American public. I just think it would be such a large military operation, and of course it would not end quickly, and maybe even not end well. So I wonder whether they would cross that line, especially given the shellacking the American military has endured in the Middle East, whether that's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and let's not forget the Ukraine, which is an American proxy war, but it's not going well for the Americans, except for the arms company. Arms weapons manufacturers.
I wanted to come on to that. A British Special Forces corporal who had been, I've seen the badge of the Special Forces Regiment when he was in Afghanistan. A British Special Forces soldier was killed far from the front lines, Keir Starmer said, though he didn't tell us where and in what circumstances. We keep hearing about NATO personnel being killed, maybe even captured, as long ago as Mariupol. Even though there is no official involvement by NATO in the war in the Ukraine, it's now abundantly clear that NATO and individual NATO members are all over and deep, knee-deep in the bloodshed in Ukraine. And we've got these four stooges, Zelensky, Merz, Macron, and Starmer. Are they still intent on getting involved in the war, or have they begun to recognize that Daddy's left the house and he's not coming back, that the US is tired of this war?
Well, first of all, on involvement, I mean, one of the things that precipitated the Russian attack on Ukraine was the fact that I think just the United States alone, if I may have the figure slightly off, about 1,500 military trainers. Ukraine was becoming a de facto NATO country, if not officially a NATO country. And that was something that, going all the way back to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, the Russian leadership had said is a red line that should not be crossed. So this has been a NATO project since before the war, and was one of the things that precipitated the reaction, or baited. Let's be clear, baited Putin to essentially send Russian troops into Ukraine. No, of course they're all over it. We know that the United States essentially runs the intelligence operations for the Ukrainians in terms of picking targets, in terms of monitoring Russian troops. That's how the Ukrainians were initially able to stop the seizure of the airport in the first few days of the Russian invasion, because all of the internal communications of the Russian military had been hacked, or were being read by U.S. intelligence, which they then fed to the Ukrainians. I mean, I have no ability to get into the heads of Starmer or Macron. These are not particularly thoughtful or moral, or I mean, these are trolls, really. Of course they can't. If Trump pulls the plug, then I don't think they have any option but to go along with essentially a cessation of the war. The war, there was always, from the American standpoint, the American military standpoint, it was always very cynical. They knew that the Ukrainians could never win a war of attrition, as I think I've said many times on your show. It's a proxy war to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin. And if Ukraine is destroyed and tens of thousands of Ukrainians are killed and wounded, well, what do the Americans care? I mean, I covered proxy wars all over the world, in El Salvador and everywhere else, and those aims have been largely achieved, but that was always the intent, and it was always going to end like this, whether it was Trump or someone else.
The war aims might be shifting, though, for the Russians. There's a great deal more attention now, rhetorical as well as far from rhetorical, highly kinetic concentration on Odessa, the Russian jewel of a city built by Catherine the Great, and Nikolaev, which were never in the mouths of Lavrov, for example, until yesterday. It's the first time I've heard him talking very powerfully about the Russianness of these two cities, and the bombardment of the port of Odessa and the destruction of electricity power there is still blacked out tonight. That might indicate that Russia's ambitions are growing, and that the tardiness of Zelensky's agreement to the American peace plan is going to cost Ukraine dearly.
Well, exactly, and that's why Zelensky has dropped his call for Ukraine to be incorporated in NATO. They're clearly the Ukrainians are being rolled back, and the longer they delay, the worse it's going to be, without question. Lavrov is not wrong. I mean, these are essentially, they may have been part of Ukraine, but they are Russian-speaking. They are dominated by ethnic Russians.
Yes, and of course the Russian Orthodox Church, which has been brutally suppressed in the rest of Ukraine, in the Zelensky-held parts of Ukraine, and on many other levels. I mean, I've been many times in Odessa in former times. And it's hard to imagine a more Russian place than Odessa. And incidentally, once upon a time, a more Jewish place. There were 150,000 Jews in Odessa when the Nazi and Romanian forces entered. There were fewer than 5,000 when the Red Army liberated it. These places and their history, their culture, they really matter to the Russian people, don't they?
Yeah, without question. And again, the historical trauma of being invaded twice in the last century, and in World War I and World War II through Ukraine, both by the Germans and then before by Napoleon. You can't discount that. That is so it does matter, and anybody who understood the historical consciousness within Russia understood that playing with Ukraine the way the United States and NATO did was playing with fire. And that's, of course, what happened.
Finally, Chris, and you've been very generous with your time, going back to the event in Australia, Netanyahu immediately blamed Iran, which people who know about things like you and me know could not be further from the truth, as one of the shooters, at least, is a Salafist scholar who hate Iran and regard Shiites as heretics who should be cruelly burned. But he might just use it, mightn't he, as a casus belli against Iran?
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu has no regard for facts or the truth. And it's very clear that the Israeli, and of course they carried out very punishing strikes against Iran. I think, what was it, 1,000 Iranian civilians were killed? I think that number is close to that. Yes. Certainly a very large number. And they're not done. There is the use or projection of Israeli power to create, in their eyes, hegemony throughout the region. Iran, Hezbollah has been crippled and weakened. Syria has been dismembered. And remember that after Assad was overthrown, Israel carried out a series of airstrikes against Syrian military facilities, although the new regime was in no way hostile to Israel, but it was about essentially denuding their capacity. And that's true with Iran. And they of course have this fantasy of regime change, that if they bomb Iran enough, the people will rise up and maybe bring back the Shah's son, which shows you how out of touch they are with Iranian sentiment. But yeah, they're clearly not done. There's been all sorts of reports coming out of the Middle East that Israel is planning another strike, and Netanyahu will seize on any event, including what happened in Australia, whether it has any connection with Iran or not, to justify it.